When intellectualism itself is constructed within the knowledge regimes of colonial matrix of power, the praxis need to be revisioned. Hope this lecture will help us to reorient doing sociology in India and to decolonize the so-called modern scientific knowledge production. We welcome you heartily, Professor Michael Borave, to this function. The reminiscence of Professor Kattakayam is to be presented by Professor Indira, a close associate of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam over many a decade. Let's listen to stories from herself. I'm not elaborating. Beyond the volumes of academic contributions, Professor Indira is known to all of us for her able leadership skills at Indian Sociology Society as the immediate past president. We welcome you, ma'am, to this function. To cut short, I also extend a pleasant welcome to the family members and friends of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam, all senior academicians, administrators, colleagues, all other budding sociologists to this function. Welcome you all. Welcome you all once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sumesh. This program has been enriched by the presence of Professor Jairam, the chairperson, National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and the chair for tonight's event. Professor Jairam also been a very close friend and comrade of Professor Kattakayam. Being his student, I have personally witnessed Kattakayam sir's love for Professor Jairam. Sir, it is indeed a matter of pride and honor to have you with us today. With utmost respect, may I now hand over the session to Professor Jairam.
Thank you, Nisha. Professor Borave, my esteemed colleagues in the profession, there are far too many here to name them. Dr. Biju Vicent, Dr. Sumesh, students of Professor Kattakayam, his colleagues and friends. I deem it a privilege to have been invited to chair this lecture for two reasons. One, I have known Professor Kattakayam for nearly half a century now. We began, I think, apart from, I think there is nobody here, not even his wife. He was not even married when I first met him. So I can claim I have the oldest, you see, of the acquaintance with John. We used to call him, you see, John. We first met sometime in 1974. And since then we have been, you see, together until fate snatched away him from our midst a couple of years back. I miss him, but this is an occasion where I could reminisce myself about my association with John. The photographs that were shown, I found myself in one or two old photographs, the black and white, you see, ones from the time, you see, when we started the journey together. The second reason why I feel I'm privileged to have been asked, you see, to chair this session is the person who is delivering, you see, it. That is Professor Michael Borave. It had been my privilege, you see, to publish one of his papers in our sociological bulletin earlier, and I am delighted, you see, to chair the session in which he is going to present, you see, the memorial lecture. I do not, and also Sumesh, I thank you very much for your very kind, you see, words. I cherish your sentiments. I think I have treated all of John's students as my own when I have interacted with them, and that was his request. So whenever we had an opportunity, I was visiting Kerala or somewhere else, we have interacted on the same plane. Thank you very much, Sumesh. I do not want to say anything about the subject of today's lecture. in fact, all of us have virtually gathered to eagerly listen to Professor Burave on this subject, especially based on the work of a scholar who is not much read, for the simple reason as part of intellectual, colonialism, and I should say intellectual imperialism, who had been blacked out. Only those who cared, to go into details of sociology, in the US could, identify, the text and think of its relevance, for India. This is done by some Indians, no doubt. But I find Professor Burave is the first American sociologist to have thought that he should bring Burave to the focus of, this discussion. Now, speaking of decolonizing sociology, is a project that we started in India right at the time of independence. Those of you who have read Professor D.P. Mukherjee and Professor I.P. Desai would remember the strong statements that they made about colonialism, of social colonialization of sociology, in India, and the need for decolonizing it. This was in the 50s. Since then, we thought, some efforts would be made to address the issues that these stalwarts had raised, but unfortunately, neocolonialism, or what came to be called as imperialism, reinforced, all the old things. So as a consequence, once in a way, we do make noise about indigenization, etc. But I have asked people, how many of you have read what I have written on indigenization? And it does not seem, to interest. In fact, you find in the mid-1980s, Professor Alatas had sounded a very interesting warning, to us, and asked us to be beware of the captive mind. That is the expression that he had used. And now his son has edited a special seminar issue on intellectual imperialism. The seminar published it in November. A very interesting issue, and in which many people reflect on Alatas' concept of the captive mind. How, having been socialized, educated in a particular orientation to sociology, we do not seem to think that there is an alternative. In fact, if there is a disenchantment with sociology in India among Indian sociologists, part of the reason is that we do not seem to find it relevant, to us, our situation anymore. We find, things happening in the country, but we are not able to grasp those from within the conceptual framework, that we have been taught, or which we have, worked. So I found, that Professor Burave choosing to talk on decolonizing sociology, and that too from the perspective of Dubas' work, is very instructive, for all of us. So I don't want, to say much on, this. As I told you, I am as eager as all of you here to listen to Professor Burave. With that, may I request Professor Burave to deliver his memorial lecture.
Okay. Well, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Let me just. Right. Well, obviously, to begin with, this is a very great honor to be here. Well, I'm here in Du Bois, and it's a great honor to be here addressing you on the occasion of the second memorial lecture to J.J. Kattakayam. And it's thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this very fine introduction, Professor Jerriman. You actually anticipate so much of what I want to say today, and thank you for indeed recognizing the significance of W.B. Du Bois globally, and for all your own work in thinking about the meaning of decolonization of sociology in India. Since this is a webinar, I'm going to read out my address so as I don't get lost or go over my time. And then I hope perhaps we can have a discussion. I don't know if that's on the agenda or not. Clearly, J.J. Kattakayam is a major figure. There are very few sociologists that I know who have organized and who have stimulated and inspired their students, so much so that they organize a series of memorial lectures on his behalf. So this is already a statement, and listening to all the accolades today suggests that I really missed a great opportunity to be one of his students. However, I did meet Professor Kattakayam on the occasion of the Diamond Jubilee Conference of the Indian Sociological Society in 2011. Professor T.K. Uman was chairing the session. Vice President of India, Hamid Ansari, gave the inaugural address, and Professor Kattakayam delivered his stirring speech as president of the Indian Sociological Society. It was a very festive occasion, organized at JNU in the open air with planes flying above and a huge crowd stretching into the distance. Professor Kattakayam treated us to an urgent lecture on the importance of sociology for the social transformation of India. After outlining the distinctive features of India's social and economic crisis, and then treating us to an overview of the history of Indian sociology, he turned to sociology's place in society. He insisted that sociology play a more significant public role, but not at the expense of professional, critical, and policy sociologies. These four sociologies balance and feed each other. I think we can say the urgency for such an expansive sociology has only grown since 2011, whether in India or indeed anywhere else in the world. Today, in honor of Professor Kattakayam, I want to introduce you to another sociologist hailing from a distant land who was entranced by India, its history and its independence struggles. His name is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He was an African-American who lived a long and tumultuous life from 1868 to 1963. He died at the age of 95. As a scholar, he started out as philosopher and then a historian, but his true passion was sociology, which undergirded his writings as a journalist, as a novelist, and a poet, as well as a scholar. Carrying unquestionable credentials as a scholar, he was best known in his role as a public sociologist, probably the greatest public sociologist to have walked this earth. He was a civil rights advocate, a Pan-Africanist, a socialist, and a peace activist. For long excluded from the sociology pantheon, he has recently become a central figure in decolonizing our discipline. After sketching his life and work, I will consider his place in decolonizing sociology and end by underlining his importance as a global sociologist by reflecting on his writings about India. So let me begin with the life of W.B. Du Bois. Brought up in a largely white Methodist community in Massachusetts, he was educated at Fisk University, a historically Black university in Tennessee, and then at Harvard, where he was the first African-American to receive a PhD in 1895. At the University of Berlin, where he was between 1892 and 94, he completed his work for a second PhD, although he was denied the formal credential because of residence requirements. Clearly a brilliant scholar, his race prevented him entering a major US university. He was confined to Black universities, first Wilberforce University and then a temporary research assistantship at the University of Pennsylvania, where he carried out the iconic study of African Americans in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899. Between 1897 and 1910, Du Bois took up his position at Atlanta University, another historically Black university, where he developed the Atlanta School of Sociology that predated the famous Chicago School by some 20 years. These were his contributions to professional sociology. While he was at Atlanta, he also wrote his most celebrated book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903, a classic of public sociology. Some know it for its critique of Booker T. Washington, a more conservative figure, but at the same time the most powerful African American in the country. Others know the book for the idea of double consciousness, how African Americans live a double life joined by the contemptuous gaze of white society. Yet others remember it for the moving accounts of impoverished lives of sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South, or of the death of Du Bois's firstborn son. The Souls of Black Folk therefore brought together a series of lyrical essays on African American life within what he called the veil. It became an instant success, read widely to this day. However, it was no more successful than his scientific works in convincing whites that blacks, at least the talented 10th, were both human and gifted. Starting out with the view that sociological knowledge would break down barriers of racism, Du Bois soon discovered that white racism was not just a product of ignorance. It had an irrational component, and it was also driven by material interests, the public and psychological wage of whiteness. Denied resources, status, and recognition, he began to question his academic career. His scientific studies were powerless to counter the racial segregation, mob violence, and lynching of African Americans. And so he left Atlanta University in 1910 to enter the public realm. He became the founding editor of The Crisis, the bi-monthly magazine of the National Association for Colored People, NAACP, a civil rights organization that he himself had co-founded. He remained editor of The Crisis for the next 24 years, during which time he became the leading Black intellectual in the US. At its peak, The Crisis had a subscription of about 100,000. It addressed every conceivable topic of interest to African Americans: art, music, politics, economy, race relations. Nothing was outside its purview. Du Bois took his training in sociology and made it public. He was no longer interested in convincing whites of the humanity of African Americans. On the contrary, he sought to convince African Americans, on the one hand, that despite slavery, they were the inheritors of a great world civilization, and on the other hand, that whites were the inhuman beings capable of inflicting the most inhumane brutality, not just on blacks, but on one another. This was the purpose of his essay, now very famous, The Foundation of Whiteness Studies, his essay called The Souls of White Folk, wherein he describes the horrors of World War I, the ruthless destruction of European nations in their struggle for control of Africa. This was one of his early sorties into the history of imperialism, how Western civilization had grown on the backs of the darker races, as he called them, of the world. The Souls of White Folk was the first in a collection of essays called Darkwater, published in 1920. Other essays included a graphic account of the race riot in East St. Louis in 1917, in which white capital played off cheap black labor from the South against more expensive white labor from Europe. Another essay entitled The Ruling of Men developed his ideas of socialism, participatory democracy combined with public ownership of the means of production. And then there was his essay on intersectional feminism, entitled The Damnation of Women. Forced to divide their lives between domestic drudgery and wage labor, women, both white and black, but particularly black, were never able to develop their talents that were demonstrated by such fervent black abolitionists as Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. These essays in Darkwater all pointed towards socialism as the future, but only, he warned, if the race problem could be solved first. That is to say, only if the socialists would make their priority the bringing together of black and white workers into some sort of joint solidarity. But he was very disappointed in efforts in this direction, whether made by trade unions or the Socialist Party, or later the Communist Party. Darkwater is a radical answer to and critique of the souls of black folk. Du Bois moves out of the veil and into the world beyond, consonant with his editorship of The Crisis, his participation in NAACP, and his commitment to Pan-Africanism. A commitment that began as early as 1900, when he participated in the first Pan-African conference and led to his pioneering role as organizer of subsequent Pan-African congresses in 1919, 1921, 1923, and 1927. Throughout his life, he was committed to Pan-Africanism, but a Pan-Africanism that actually stretched all the way to Asia, especially India, where he fantasized the origins of a Black Dravidian civilization that had endured invasion after invasion. And with this Black Dravidian civilization, he drew parallels to the African Americans in the United States. One of the most significant moments in Du Bois's life was his first visit to the Soviet Union in 1926. Until then, he had been agnostic about the Russian Revolution. Violent revolution was not a solution to the problems that plagued the US, he said, but it might be a solution elsewhere. After spending 3 months in the Soviet Union in 1926, impressed by the serious attempts at eliminating poverty and the apparent absence of racism, he declared that if what he had seen and what he had heard was Bolshevism, then he was a Bolshevik. That experience, and then the beginning of the Depression years in the US, led him down a Marxist path, although he was always careful to keep a distance from the Communist Party of the United States. In 1935, Du Bois published Black Reconstruction in America, an avowedly Marxist account of the US Civil War of 1861 to 1865, the post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1876, and the racist reaction to Reconstruction that would follow. This book, this humongous book that amounts to over 700 pages of very fine, small type, this book is now regarded as his masterpiece. So let me give you a flavor of its importance. Written at a time when historians and folk wisdom viewed the period of Reconstruction after the Northern victory in the Civil War as a period of utter depravity and unmitigated catastrophe, a view that reflected the racist contempt for African Americans pervasive among whites. Du Bois' account of Reconstruction turned this picture upside down. For him, Reconstruction was a short period, a decade, when African American men assumed the vote, African American politicians assumed a modicum of power, were elected to office, and when progressive social legislation was passed, to be sure, in some southern states more than others. And finally, and most importantly for Du Bois, when universal education expanded to include poor Blacks and poor whites. All these achievements would be reversed after Reconstruction. Du Bois not only challenged the reigning interpretation of Reconstruction, he introduced a novel approach to the origins and conduct of the Civil War itself. Against the idea that it was fought to preserve the Union, Du Bois gave it a global capitalist twist, arguing that the expansion of British textile industry in the first half of the 19th century led to increased demand for cotton and thence to the intensification of slavery in the US South. To meet demand, Southern planters needed to extend slavery to new geographical areas. And that, Du Bois argues, was anathema to Northern industrial capital and, of course, to the abolitionists. The Republicans in power could accept confining slavery to the Confederate states, but they would not allow it to move west or north. The expansion of slavery was the real bone of contention that precipitated the Civil War. Once the war began, it looked as though the balance of military forces would favor the South. Inspired by the presence of Unionist troops, however, 500,000 of the 4 million enslaved fled the plantations, eventually turning the balance of power in favor of the North. Their disaffection disrupted supplies for the Southern armies, but more important, the Northern armies enlisted the fugitives, first reluctantly and then enthusiastically. For when they fought, African Americans did so with courage and determination, possessed as they were by the idea that this was their war, especially after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Du Bois turned this defection from the plantations as a general strike, a provocative formulation indeed, but it served to underline the way that African Americans had temporarily taken history into their own hands, becoming authors of their own future. Once the war was won, the Northern military established themselves in the South in an attempt to contain the reign of terror that spread through the Confederacy, but also to support the extension of franchise, education, and broad equality. However, once Northern capital had vanquished the planter class and with it the slave system of production, they were ready to strike a compromise that would see the Northern armies leaving the South a decade later. Power was handed back to the planter class that set about inducing poor whites to throw in their lot with white rule rather than join forces with blacks. The wages of whiteness divided white from black, even though both were engaged in new forms of tenancy and sharecropping. If Reconstruction demonstrated the possibility of an interracial democracy, it proved to be a failure. But Du Bois insisted that we call this a splendid failure. It showed the possibilities of what could be. It took conventional US historians another 30 years to catch up with and accept Du Bois's ideas. Such was the genius of Du Bois. Today, his ideas are taken as conventional wisdom. As for so many, the 1930s were a turning point in Du Bois's intellectual life. Fired by the NAACP for his radicalism, he left the crisis and returned to Atlanta University in 1934. He plunged into the writings of Karl Marx. As he was writing Black Reconstruction, Du Bois was also searching for a socialist vision in the present, in the 1930s. He found it, ironically enough, in the racial segregation that characterized the US, deeper in the South, but also in the North. His vision was to build a Negro nation within the nation, a cooperative commonwealth that will be separate from the mainstream economy and take on socialist characteristics. This, however, was another splendid failure, one that barely got off the ground. Du Bois was 10 years at Atlanta University before being expelled, supposedly because he was getting too old. He was, after all, 76. But he was a difficult man to get on with, and his independent radicalism was once again an embarrassment to the university. He left the university to rejoin the NAACP for 4 years. The NAACP thought this would be a sinecure, and Du Bois at the age of 76 would be docile, would withdraw from politics. But they were wrong. And very soon, he clashed again politically with the leadership of the NAACP. He was cast out of the NAACP to fight his battles on new terrains, and those battles turned increasingly outwards. Following World War II, Du Bois's energies were divided between two projects. One was directed toward the struggle for independence among colonies in Africa and Asia, initially aimed at the United Nations and organizing of the Pan-African Congress of 1945. In this period, after he left the NAACP, he wrote two books. The first, Color and Democracy, published in 1945, underlined the importance of self-determination for the colonized people of the world. Democracy will only survive, he claimed, if it takes roots across the world. The second book, The World and Africa, written in 1947, extended ideas he had presented in 2 earlier books, elaborating the history of Africa and its civilization, the way imperialism had plundered the continent, first through the slave trade and then through the exploitation of its labor for the extraction of natural resources. If his Pan-African Americanism was his first project, his second project was a deep involvement in the international peace movement, organizing and attending the post-war opposition to nuclear arms. This put him in the Soviet camp and in direct opposition to the US state. He was indicted by the State Department as an undeclared agent of a foreign principal and put on trial in 1951. Du Bois had campaigned far and wide in his own defense, and letters of support poured in from all corners of the world. At the trial itself, it became clear he was being framed by a colleague who had turned state witness, and the judge threw the case out. Du Bois was free, but in revenge, the State Department confiscated his passport. He could not travel until 1958, when the Supreme Court deemed the confiscation to have been illegal, and he was now free at the age of 90 to travel, and travel he did, to Europe, the Soviet Union, and China. Wherever he went in the communist bloc, he received VIP treatment, an internationally renowned critic of the US, who openly declared his support for socialism. Here, his 2 projects became one, as he took the Soviet Union and China to be models that Africa and other colonies could copy as they became independent nations. Returning to the US after 6 months away, when he was dined and wined by world leaders, fearing imprisonment, he and his second wife, Shirley Graham, accepted President Kwame Nkrumah's invitation to make his home in Ghana. He moved there in 1961, where he died in 1963 at the age of 95, the end of an extraordinary life. Why am I telling you all this? After all, I'm supposed to be talking about decolonizing sociology. But first, I want to convey to you, with this thumbnail sketch of Du Bois's life, what it can mean to be a politically engaged scholar. I want to give you a sense of his ideas and how his ideas were shaped by his political engagement. I want to convey how he wove together the professional, critical, and public sociologists, just as Professor Kattakayam proposed in his celebrated address. But I'm telling you this story for a second reason. W.B. Du Bois has been discovered by US sociology, and in recent years, he has become central to decolonizing our discipline. At the center of today's renaissance of Du Bois is Alden Morris, an African-American sociologist, president of the American Sociological Association last year, and author of a very important book on the battle for civil rights in the South. But even more important, author of the 2015 book, Scholar Denied, an account of the way Du Bois has been systematically excluded and derogated by the sociology profession, a sign, according to Morris, of its racism. Morris argues that Du Bois's leadership of the Atlanta School between 1897 and 1910 makes him the true founder of US sociology, and not Robert Park of the famed Chicago School. A number of things have to be said about Morris's powerful intervention in sociology. First, and most important, is his bringing of Du Bois to the forefront, accelerating a process that had been taking place for the previous 20 years. Second, there is no doubt that racism was key to the exclusion of Du Bois from the sociology profession, but racism was not the only issue, as other African Americans were accepted by white sociology. One other factor is US sociology's repudiation of public sociology, at least a public sociology that is fought not from within the university, but in the trenches of civil society, just as Professor Kattakayam inspired so many to do. Du Bois did spend a good proportion of his life in the university, in toto, some 25 years after receiving his PhD, but his real power as a public sociologist came as the editor of The Crisis. His writings in numerous magazines and newspapers, his lyrical essays and his writings of novels, and then his more policy-flavored role in the NAACP, in the Council for African Affairs and the Peace Information Center. Professional sociology turns its back on those who dare to pronounce on matters of public importance outside the control of the professional community. Such adventurers are condemned for their politicization of sociology. Du Bois, however, took no notice of such critics. Indeed, his innovations, his scientific breakthroughs came about precisely because he was not prisoner of professional sociology. He had internalized the strictures and rigors of academic work, but he pursued them outside the academy, very often for a public audience. To make matters worse, as he was excluded from the academy, as he turned to the public sphere, as he fought for civil rights, at the same time he became ever more critical of the US, ever more radical in his politics, while he only became a member of the Communist Party just before leaving the US, a final symbolic gesture of hostility to the US state. Nonetheless, he never made a secret of his sympathies for the Soviet Union and China. He never made a secret of his commitments to socialism and Marxism. You can be sure that did not win him friends within sociology, a largely conservative discipline. Consistent with an image of professional sociology, Morris and others confined their attention to the early Du Bois of the Philadelphia Negro and the Atlanta School, the more conservative and empiricist of his writings. Even The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903, undoubtedly a work of sociological genius, had a conservative ethos, especially when compared to Darkwater, written 17 years later. It turns out, therefore, and not surprisingly, that Du Bois, now embraced by sociology, is largely the professional Du Bois, the conservative Du Bois, and above all, the Du Bois focused on the US, conveniently overlooking his Pan-Africanism and his campaigns against imperialism. Now, finally, we can come to the question of decolonizing sociology. Alden Morris's book is addressed to US sociologists. The claim that Du Bois' professional sociology antedated the Chicago School by 20 years. But that's no achievement. Indeed, it's an insult to compare Du Bois with Robert Parker, Ernest Burgess, and the Chicago School, so provincial, so empiricist. Who now reads the Chicago School? If we are in the business of decolonizing sociology, then the sparring partners for Du Bois have to be Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, far more formidable social theorists than the Chicago amateurs. Decolonizing sociology must tackle the blind spots of those canonical figures. Moreover, engaging these figures will only strengthen Du Boisian sociology, surface its contributions, and send sociology in new directions. Centering the experiential, recognizing we are part of the world we study, making explicit the values that drive our research rather than hiding behind so-called value neutrality, developing theories of global capitalism as seen from the standpoint of the subaltern, and above all, endorsing sociology's public role. These are the issues that Du Bois forces us to confront. That is, if we take into consideration the entire gamut of his writings. This is how I see Du Bois's contribution to decolonizing sociology. It is important to attend to our founders, how their blind spots have shaped the development of our discipline. We should attend to their Eurocentrism, to their decentering of race and gender and sexuality, and much more. But we should be careful not to reproduce another colonialism in the process. US sociology is uniquely unconscious and, where conscious, uniquely uncritical of the way it dominates the global field of sociology. There are obvious reasons for this domination. The US harbors the greatest concentration of resources for the pursuit of science. The US controls the majority of so-called international journals, all published in English. The US defines what is a good university through international rankings. US universities train the highest proportion of foreign PhDs who then dominate the sociology of their home country. These and other factors that indeed Farid Al-Attas has pointed to in much of his work are all factors we have to take into account. This is not all bad. Unfortunately, US sociology is not of a single mind on so many issues. But still, my point is that what happens in the US does shape what happens elsewhere. And so the issue becomes, when US sociology decolonizes itself by reformulating its foundations, how does this affect its relationship to other sociologies, especially Southern sociologies? This is where Du Bois is very relevant. By appropriating the most conservative, the most narrow version of Du Bois, the Du Bois focused on the US, there is a danger that in the name of decolonization, the US intensifies its colonization of sociology elsewhere. It's difficult for Indian sociologists to get involved in debates about race and class in the history of the US. But if US sociology were to recognize Du Bois's global sociology, this would create a space for others, for Indian sociologists, for example, to make their distinctive contributions. Let me be specific. In 1928, already under the influence of Comintern policies and abandoning hope for interracial working class solidarity in the US, Du Bois turns to a vision of international solidarity along lines of race, the unification of what he called the darker races for world revolution. He gives expression to this vision in a surreal novel, Dark Princess, revolving around Kautilya, the Indian princess of Bodhpur, and Matthew Towns, the African-American medical student escaping the impossible racism in the US. They meet in Berlin, where Matthew is living in voluntary exile. There, by happen chance, he rescues Kautilya from the harassment of two white Americans. She introduces him to her friends, internationalist conspirators from Japan, China, Egypt, and India, who all believe they are the superior race, superior to the white race. They are attended by white servants, and yet, ironically, they are steeped in Western art and literature. They are at the same time contemptuous of African Americans as a lost cause, embarrassing Matthew to his face. Kautilya, however, disagrees with her aristocratic internationalists, calling on Matthew to return to the US and organize African Americans. The novel unfolds with him trying to organize railroad porters and then trying his hand as a Chicago politician, dropping out at the very moment of success. Princess Kautilya appears unexpectedly at different points in their budding romance, and the novel ends with Kautilya bearing their child in Matthew's birthplace in Virginia, in the United States. Kautilya proclaims the Black Belt of the South as originating a vision of a new emancipated world. The novel is intricate and complex, exploring relations of race, class, and gender in a far more nuanced way than models of intersectionality. The backstory of the novel is important. Du Bois never visited India, but he had devoted much time to studying Indian history. He had read Tagore and learned much from his friend Lajpat Rai, the militant Hindu nationalist exiled in the US. Beginning after World War I, the crisis, and indeed the African-American press more generally, reported regularly on developments in the Indian independence movement. For Du Bois, India was the epicenter of anti-colonial struggles. Du Bois worshipped Gandhi as a spiritual and political leader. But Du Bois was also drawn to Nehru, with whom he shared an elite Western education, a commitment to a modernist socialism. Both had been deeply influenced by their visits to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Du Bois wrote encomia to both Gandhi and Nehru. In a fascinating article in the Economic and Political Weekly, S.D. Kapoor identifies Du Bois neither with Gandhi nor with Nehru, but with Ambedkar, and it makes a lot of sense. They wrote of African Americans and Dalits in the same way, a despised population that inhabits a zone of non-existence. In recognition of the similarities, Du Bois often referred to African Americans as a color caste, and their solutions were similarly radical. Just as for Ambedkar, the liberation of Dalits required the annihilation of caste, which in turn entailed the abolition of Hinduism, so For Du Bois, the dissolution of the racial order was necessary for the liberation of African Americans, which in turn entailed the abolition of capitalism. If Ambedkar's nemesis was Gandhi, Du Bois' nemesis was Booker T. Washington. The parallels are powerful. And yet here is the paradox. In his writings on India, Du Bois was devoted to Gandhi and rarely mentioned Ambedkar, or indeed the struggles of Dalits. Du Bois preferred to eulogize the struggle for Indian independence, in which Gandhi played such a prominent role. And when independence arrived on August 15th, Du Bois celebrated it as the greatest historical date of the 19th and 20th centuries. When Du Bois did talk about divisions in post-independence India, they revolved around religion or states, but not around caste. For Du Bois, it was national self-determination at all costs. But for Ambedkar, independence was not enough, since it did not guarantee the dissolution of caste, the bane of India. I think it is fair to say that Du Bois failed to extend his Marxist analysis of the US to countries of the global South, not just India, but Africa too. I must bring this long and winding tour through the life and works of W. Du Bois to an end. The entry of Du Bois into US sociology is a momentous move, but inasmuch as the entry is confined to his early Americanist writings, we will be doing a disservice to his genius, to his manifold role as a public sociologist, and to his role as a global sociologist, and to the project of decolonizing sociology. In his global vision, he is virtually without peer among sociologists. At a time when we desperately need a global sociology that addresses questions of climate change, environmental destruction, refugees, financial capital, growing inequality and precarity, not to mention pandemics and the virus of authoritarianism. At this time, W.B. Du Bois has to be an inspiration, which is not to say he is, as I have shown, without flaws. Indeed, his flaws are what make him so interesting, so challenging to audiences across the world. His global vistas and imaginations encourage all sociologists to partake in public sociology, to think about the meaning of decolonizing sociology, and to meet the challenge and promise that Professor Kattakayam left us with. Thank you very much.
Okay. Professor Brave, I think all those who are attending this lecture in the virtual mode will agree with me that it has been an interesting and insightful lecture, bringing to our notice the work of Du Bois, how it is relevant if we have, you see, to decolonize the sociology in India. I don't want, you see, to engage in any discussion on this with you at this stage. If time permits, let's see, you say that I may have one or two points to make. But at the same time, since you have completed your lecture well in time and have generously offered to entertain a few questions, though it is not customary to entertain lectures in memorial lectures, I would make use of your generosity and invite people here to ask and raise questions. Please be brief so that we are here more to listen to Professor Brave. Okay. You can raise your hands. Would want to go first?
Professor Jairam, may I?
Please, please.
I am Professor Shruti Tambe from Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Hello, Professor Brave. We have met at Pune also many times and in other places too. My question pertains to your last point in the lecture of how do we really decolonize sociology? because many times one sees a kind of uneasiness and discomfort when there is a discussion about decolonizing sociology. So much so that sometimes senior professors have even said that you guys are going to destroy sociology completely with this kind of argument. That's so. How do you respond to that? A and B. How do you respond to the projects of Walter Mignolo and others, where the darker side of modernity and decoloniality and modernity are being seen together as mechanisms of violence, epistemic and otherwise? This project has gone much ahead now. How do you respond to that particular ongoing project where scholars from across the world have combined their insights? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, yes, indeed. To your first question, there is a generational struggle. You know, people of my generation, we've been brought up on Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. We've studied them seriously. We teach them, and we're invested in their perpetuation just for intellectual reasons. And so there's a sort of inertia when it comes to transforming sociology. And yes, naturally, people will say, if you get rid of Marx, Weber, Durkheim, then indeed that's the end of sociology. That's what we say in the United States, or some people say in the United States. But, you know, we have to look at these things historically. The canon has not always been the canon. The canon is dynamic. The canon changes. The canon was first, in a sense, invented by a fellow called Talcott Parsons, who had resources of Harvard behind him. And what was his canon? His canon was Marshall, Pareto, Weber, and Durkheim. Those four figures. Those were the canonical figures. He deliberately excluded Marx. And this was a period of the Cold War, that he maintained that Marx was a theorist whose ideas were entirely confined to the 19th century. Well, he himself even dropped Marshall and Pareto, and he was left with Marx and Durkheim, with Weber and Durkheim. So he already changed it. But then come the 1960s, when the Parsonsian framework came out of touch with society, so we then introduce Marx and feminism. The canon changes. The canon changes, and we're now another moment of canonical change and canonical flux. Now, my view is that you don't just throw Marx, Weber, and Durkheim out, but you bring Du Bois in to a conversation with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And in my view, that will have the effect of actually demonstrating quite clearly the limitations of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. But it will also have the effect of strengthening Du Bois by bringing him into conversation with theorists that have a more systemic approach to sociology. As I said in my talk, if we take Du Bois seriously, then we will be looking at a different type of sociology, an experientially based sociology, a moral science in which we make clear what our moral foundations are, a global vision of sociology in which we look at global capitalism from the standpoint of the subaltern, and have a public moment. But I think what is important is to have a debate, a discussion, a conversation between Du Bois and these three others, and to see to what extent we can reconstruct, or to which the defenders of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim can reconstruct themselves in the process of having an engagement with Du Bois. You know, Talcott Parsons read Weber and Durkheim completely differently to the way Durkheim and Weber were read after the intervention of Marxism. Marxism led to a more radical Durkheim, a Durkheim that actually envisioned a future socialism, a sort of guild socialism. And in Weber's analysis, we moved away from sort of the centrality of values to the centrality of domination. We should give Weber, Marx, and Durkheim a chance to reconstruct themselves in the light of the challenges that Du Bois makes. So I'm for a very exciting discussion and debate about that would bring together these three older characters that we have got so used to, at least in the West, and on the one side, and Du Bois on the other. But of course, the whole point of my talk is that Du Bois cannot be reduced to his early writings, that we have to recognize there is a Du Boisian early moment, which I would call his Durkheimian moment, a second moment, which is his anti-Weberian moment, and then there is a third moment, which is his Marxist moment. So we have to recognize the extent, plurality, and scope of Du Bois's writings when we engage in this conversation. I think this will make a very exciting time, and it will move sociology in all sorts of new directions. So I'm not one for abolishing the canon, and in abolishing the canon, I should say, we are falling into the hands of those who want to restrict sociology to a very narrow positivist vision, of sociology. Many of my colleagues think studying theory, it's a waste of time. We should get on with the issues of the day. And we should just, no, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, they're from the past. They're from basically the 19th century, early 20th century. We've got beyond them. We don't need them. Yeah. So I'm of the view that would indeed lead to a very different sociology, which will become just a suburb of economics. And that is something that I don't look forward to. So I'm all for bringing Du Bois in, starting a conversation, reconstructing the foundations of sociology. All right, that was a long answer to your question. Now, your second question, you're talking about, I wasn't quite clear what you're getting at. Can you reformulate it slightly or formulate it again?
I was just saying that across the globe, there are already many projects going on to decolonize sociology, including the one where Hautonji and Minolo and others are working. Why are you choosing just one trajectory of only going back to Du Bois?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, why Du Bois? Well, that's why I spent. Oops, somebody's having a conversation with somebody else. Yes. Why Du Bois? Well, in part, it is part of the battles I'm fighting in the United States, and of course, it's not just the United States, in England too, and other places in Europe. Why Du Bois? I try to show the specificity of his sociology, how it changes, the breadth of his sociology, and it is, after all, a debate that. When I talk about decolonizing sociology, it is something that has to happen in the United States. And if it has to happen in the United States, then we are best off drawing on the inspiration of a figure like Du Bois. I myself am particularly interested in the relationship between what I call the members of a Black Marxist branch of Marxism. And in that Black Marxism branch, and by Black Marxism, I don't mean Marxists who are Black, I mean a Marxism that takes the standpoint of the, quote, darker races in the world. And included in those, in that branch of Marxism are people like C.L.R. James, Stuart Hall, Oliver Cromwell Cox, and Frantz Fanon. Those are sort of major figures. Again, I suppose that's influenced by my own interests in Africa and in Marxism. But of course, there are other ways. Whoa. Here.
Professor Burave, there is a question of Professor Kamala Ganesh.
Okay, that's my brief answer.
how do you reconcile his fantasy of Dravidian civilizational superiority with his more grounded critique of Western society? The question is not chat.
Sorry, say that again.
How do you reconcile his fantasy of Dravidian civilizational superiority with his more grounded critique of Western society?
Yes, it's difficult. Yes, I mean, his vision, his history of India is very much informed by a sort of Orientalist vision. And he writes, there is a chapter in the book, The World in Africa, written in 1947, precisely on this linkage between the United States and India through this idea of a Black Dravidian civilization. Du Bois is fascinating because from the very beginning, from as early as 1915, he's trying to constitute African Americans as part of a great civilization, that they came from a great civilization. And he writes, it's called The Negro in 1915. In 1925, he writes The Gift of Black Folk. In 1939, he writes the book Black Folk Then and Now. And then there is 1947, The World in Africa. All these books have a strong focus on trying to constitute a sense amongst African Americans that they are part of an important civilization, that they actually belong to something they have in common with the darker races of the world. Which is, of course, the theme of Dark Princess. So I think he's trying to build a sense of their own entitlement, a collective consciousness, so that they become aware that they can be makers of their own history, that they can participate politically in the transformation of the world in which they are a subjugated race. So I think he's drawing on, my view is he's drawing on this historical context to bolster the political struggles that he knows will be necessary for African Americans to advance their interests in the United States, but also elsewhere.
Professor Burave, there is one last question. How does American sociology look at Du Bois? As a Black sociologist or a sociologist?
Oh my God. Well, he's looked upon as a sociologist that is also Black. And that, I mean, first of all, I should say there is no homogeneous view, no single view amongst American sociologists towards Du Bois. But let me project my vision onto my colleagues in the United States. He's looked at as a sociologist, but a Black sociologist, and as a Black sociologist, a sociologist who has experienced racial subjugation in his own life, and that racial subjugation informs the sociology that he produces. Of course, there's a lot. I mean, there's so many. For so long, Du Bois was first of all, Du Bois's later writings was dismissed, hagiographic dismissal. And very often when you talk about Du Bois, there will always be sociologists in the audience who will say, well, he embraced Stalin, and he supported the Soviet Union. How can we take this man seriously? So there's always going to be that perspective on Du Bois. But I think of late, in other disciplines, more prominently than in sociology, his later writings have become the focus of attention and great interest. And that's why I was actually talking about his connection to India. So yes, so there are other ways in which Du Bois is dismissed because of his elitism. That's another famous and important critique. He was an elitist. You have to just look at all the pictures of himself in his German regalia, and his walking stick and his gloves and his bowler hat. I mean, he did conjure up a man of great civilization and elitist, but what is so interesting that combined with his commitment ultimately to Western civilization, though recognizing that Western civilization is the product of imperialism, his commitment to Western civilization always went along with studies that always started with the experience on the ground of usually African Americans, but sometimes even whites. So yeah, he's a very complicated figure, and therefore he gives rise to a very complicated sets of responses, which I believe could be the foundation of a great new sociology, not just in the United States, but in many other places in the world.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Jairam, can I ask a small question?
Please hold on. Thank you for taking these questions. I think there was a goof up on my part. There was another component, you see, of the program. In my excitement, you see, to listen to you, I overlooked that. With profound apologies, you see, to Professor Indira, who should have, you see, come out with her reminiscences of Kattakayam. I ignored, I don't know. I apologize, you see, to Dr. Indira. You should not have.
No, please, it's a.
I think it was my excitement to say of wanting to listen to Professor Burave on the bar that it slipped. I apologize again, and I request Dr. Indira, you see, to present her reminiscences of Professor Kattakayam.
Thank you. Good evening. Namaste to all of you. Professor Jairam, Professor Michael Burave, members of the family of John Kattakayam, my teachers here, and all my colleagues and friends. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank my colleagues from Professor JJK Students Fraternity and the Institute for Social Research and Action. Well, I have known Professor Kattakayam for almost 3.5 decades now, and within 10 minutes, it's really difficult to, talk about a lot of memories that I have, but I'll definitely try to do my best. That's why I noted down all the points, because I also don't want to overshoot my time. Well, as I said, this is an opportunity for me to share my memories in this memoir of my dear friend, colleague, and mentor, Professor John Kattakayam. It has still not sunk into my mind that John is not with us, but this distance between him and us, I think, is only physical, and he always lives in our hearts, and he has this larger than life image which continues to inspire all of us who are associated with him. And if there's one thing that gives me great pain, it is to refer to John in past tense, and I will not do it. I've spent several moments of learning and unlearning about the many faces of the world of sociology from John. And he's one of those rare persons whose life, work, and the impact he has left on the discipline and its practitioners will live well beyond his time. My association with John, as I said, lasts for more than 3.5 decades. And I still remember that I received one of the first invitations to participate in a seminar from John in the year 1989. It was September 1989, which he had organized on agrarian tensions, peasant struggles, and peasant movements in Trivandrum. I was so excited about this paper because, as I said, this was one of the earliest invitations I ever received in my academic career to participate in a seminar and present a paper. And I prepared with all enthusiasm that when I saw the seniors from the world of academia and the movement from all across the country discussing, dissenting, debating, but engaging in such serious deliberations going on up to late evening, I felt very what should I say, disturbed, perturbed week. And I told John, I don't think I'll read my paper. I'll just sit and listen. And he was very nice and said, no. He tried to tell me, but I said, no, I don't want to do that. So he said, all right, it's your comfort. Do, as you want to. But what I want to say here is the sheer professionalism with which this event was organized by John is etched in my heart and memory today, even after 34 years. And I must say that I could see the same spirit, commitment, seriousness that I felt in a consultation that John had organized in 2019. That time I was the president of Indian Sociological Society. And the way in 2018, and the way he always included students. This is what I consider very important and a great takeaway for all of us. Students, research scholars, and faculty from not only the university, but from across the colleges, I think was a lesson in itself. And John combined many roles as a teacher, be it innovation or inclusion, all these words which we are using today. But John had started inculcating these values in his professional life way before they made an entry in a formal way into the academic world. I think rather than expecting sociology to come where he was primarily located, he went wherever sociology beckoned. And his love for the subject was such that he shared his knowledge, experience wholeheartedly, and gave such meaningful and viable leads to all those, irrespective of whether they were his acquaintances or newcomers. I think he was a true champion of what we're saying called doing sociology and not just speaking sociology or writing sociology. And I think in the context of the lecture on decolonizing sociology that we have just heard from Professor Burave, John's approach is very, very important. And as an institution builder, John's mark is felt not just in his department, but all the institutions with which he was associated, because I have worked with him and I have seen him as, somebody who started the Kerala Sociological Association, as secretary and president of Indian Sociological Society, and also in the department as director of the academic staff college at the University of Kerala. He, built such an institutional network that he drew sociological interest to, and of course, all of us are very well aware of the role that he played in drawing sociological interest towards the study of the elderly. And John always gave his full attention, time, and forethought to whoever he came into contact with him. I have never heard him say, I have no time, a lesson to many who keep on giving the busy excuse. And also John, in spite of being very kind, very nice to everybody, knew when to say yes and when to say no. This is something I have learned from him, and I've seen him do this in my long association with him. And John's labor of love, as I call it, is seen in the way he built and sustained social networks, never hesitating to support a deserving cause or a person. He was always there to make thousands of phone calls, write letters, and the fact that he was with us was itself a great source of strength. Though he reached many positions of leadership, this has already been said by his students and my friends here, he never let power or position affect his simplicity and human qualities. His love for travel, his readiness to bear hardships is another model, I think, which many should follow. Another experience which I think I'm very, concerned to talk about is that we have all had this experience when we have worked with John, and which we always will cherish, is the warm welcome we got in Professor Kattakayam's house whenever we were visiting Thiruvananthapuram. If he did not have really a pressing engagement, he always came to the railway station, bus stand, airport to receive a visitor, or his vehicle would be there. So the same courtesy he would also extend when we left Thiruvananthapuram, and many of his friends have had this experience. And whenever the sociology fraternity had to visit Trivandrum, we were never really worried about where we would stay because we had a home in John's home. And this is something that will always stay in our hearts and is definitely, I think, something which the next generation should follow. And as I said, it's really difficult for me to talk in detail about John. One is the time factor, and the other is the trail he has left behind, so full of warm and pleasant memories that it's difficult to do justice. All I can say is that he is one of the few academic leaders whose fraternity is becoming smaller and smaller today, who always stands out for the way he pushed us and his students and those who came across him to achieve. He would never take no or excuses for an answer. I always will remember when I said, I can't do it, sorry, the way he, made me write when they were bringing about the Diamond Jubilee volumes of ISS. And he said, I will not take a no from you. And when our spirits were down, the way he pushed us, the kind of positive energy that surrounded him, that he shared with others, is something, that John always spread around. And so he always thought ahead of his times. One of our friends has already mentioned that, did not believe in wasting time, started preparing for an event well ahead of times, whether it was travel in India, travel abroad, travel for NAC, or organization of any event. He was always there when his intervention was needed. And he really believed in what today we call democracy.
Professor Indira, you are muted. Professor Indira, you are muted.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you. I'd like to close this memoir by saying, thank you, John, for all your support, encouragement, and being with me, and all your students, well-wishers, friends. You are there with us, and the movements that you gave us are momentous, and all those memories will always live with us. As Professor Jairam said, we will miss him, but he's always there with us. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Indira, for your reminiscences. I think all those who knew Professor Kattakayam would agree with every word that you have said. We have all been beneficiaries of his generosity, affection, regards, help, whatever one would like to call. I would like now, I think the time is coming to an end. I would like to conclude this program, but before I request Dr. Biju Vincent to give the vote of thanks, on my own, I would like to thank Professor Michael Burave for the excellent and insightful lecture, which should make every Indian sociologist think about the state of affairs in their own discipline. I also thank Professor Indira for the reminiscences, which in a way took me in my memories to my memories of my own association with John. Finally, I would like to compliment his students for the painstaking efforts they have put in organizing a collective and holding the second memorial lecture. I think it is a learning experience for them, just as it is a learning experience for all of us. And I would like also to take this opportunity to convey my affectionate regards to Jisha and GB, children of John, and also to the most graceful lady in Trivandrum that I have met. Mrs. Grace Kattakayam. Now may I request Biju Vincent, you see, to give the formal vote of thanks.
Not
Yeah,
giving-
thank you. Nisha, please go.
Yes. So this brings us almost to the end of the befitting gesture for all that Professor Kattakayam has been. I thank Professor Jairam, Professor Burave, and Professor Indira for being part of this program and giving us such an enriching evening. May I now invite Dr. Lakshmi V. Nair, Professor, Indian Institute of Space Science and Technology, in extending our words of thanks to the august audience.
Good evening, one and all. Respected dignitaries who have graced the stage today and those off the stage. To teach is to touch a life forever, with ideas that change perspective, with habits that change ways of being, with bonds that change one's relation to communities. A teacher's influence transforms a student's life. And today, in the second memorial lecture, instituted in honor of Professor Jacob John Kattakayam, the inspiration and ripples this great teacher has sparked in the life of his students and colleagues has traveled a bit more further. We have tried to connect ideas and people. It is with great pleasure that I'm here today to express our gratitude to each and every individual who have made this session possible. Professor N. Jairam, who has chaired the session today, is an eminent sociologist who has deep acquaintance with Kattakayam sir. Professor Jairam has remembered his 50 years long association and friendship with Professor Kattakayam, and today very quickly touched on very pertinent themes such as decolonializing sociology in India after independence, to new colonialism, to intellectual imperialism. On behalf of JJK Student Collective and all those who have present here, I express our sincere gratitude to you, sir, for sharing your time, grace, and wisdom in this gathering. One of the most powerful way a teacher touches a student's life is by igniting critical thinking in the student's intellect. The tradition of this critical thinking handed down by our dear Kattakayam sir was kept robust by Professor Michael Burave, who delivered the memorial lecture today on a topic very pertinent to both senior and budding sociologists alike. The legacy of Du Bois and the implication his thought have in decluttering and decolonializing our academic mind. Thank you, sir, for your very rigorous and sharp commentary on the same. We also respect the interest and readiness you have shown in joining us, despite the time difference and other logistic challenges. Thank you so much, sir. Memories, when shared, extend the blessing of a person's life as a shade to those who love him. Professor Indira is a towering academician who has shared her trial with Professor Kattakayam. Her words were indeed a shade of memory for us today and has made most of us very emotional. I thank you, ma'am, from the bottom of my heart for the memoir you have presented about our beloved Kattakayam sir. I thank the community of well-wishers, the community of students, formal and informal, teachers from schools to college to university. Many of them were Kattakayam sir's close associate, his family, Gracie and Jibe and Jisha, and all others who have come together to remember Professor Kattakayam and to reflect together as a collective of intellectuals. It is this spirit of camaraderie and inquiry that you have shown has become the reason for the success of a discipline as social as what sociology is today. Let me also acknowledge the tireless industrious workforce and the thought behind the stage today. Let me begin by thanking the coordinators of the program, Dr. Biju Vincent and Dr. Sumesh for his gracious welcome address. Both of them were instrumental in shaping the program as it is today. Now, Dr. Nisha Jolly Nelson opened the session with very touching words of introduction. Thank you, Nisha. Different committees were formed for the program, which include Program Committee, Invitation Publicity Committee, Documentation Committee, and the Technical Committee. all from the scholars of Kattakayam, sir. Each of them have generously answered the call and need for this meeting and has been instrumental in making this session a huge success. I thank each of you wholeheartedly. So let us continue to remember, reflect, relate, and grow together. And through this, we reiterate the legacy of teachers like Professor Jacob John Kattakayam and also kindle the promise of new minds to evolve like them. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi. Amidst the euphoria of hearing the legends, let's wind the session carrying with us fond memories of the gentle colossus, Professor Kattakayam. With this nod, let's bid good night, only to meet again. Thank you.